You ought to know she done sold it out. Oh, you ought to know she done sold it. You ought to know, she done sold it out.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we enter the Lost Bordello, near the opera, Paris, 1935. This chapter is all joy, if a little too much information for his readers. It focuses on his first trip to Paris in 1935, where he is guided to an almost magical bordello, filled with every type of woman in the world. We're back to Saroyan's fast-paced, rhythmic writing here. He dashes from street to street, stopping in the Café de la Paix and the Hotel Scribe to surround himself with Parisian artists and writers. He writes, "I was there, I, myself, in person, not a dream, not a movie, and the world was a pretty girl I meant to get. I was sure Paris was the place to have her." Remember, we're only about 10 years past the great American writing boom of the 1920s, where expats like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound, the Lost Generation as they were called, romanticized the Parisian art scene after World War I. Gertrude Stein, who had already been in Paris for some time by then, helped launch the careers of many expats. It was reported in the celebrity press of 1935 that Saroyan was the young American author that Stein most wanted to meet. I don't want to draw too many false connections, but we could compare that cohort of the Lost Generation to the Lost Bordello. The libertines of the Lost Generation were there in Paris using their emotional trauma to sustain themselves financially. Sort of like a brothel? Was Saroyan playing on words? Well, that's for you and your thesis faculty to figure out. The rest of us can test out the theory with a chuckle or a knowing nod. It's possible Saroyan just couldn't find the bordello again. Back in the chapter, Saroyan is bouncing around Paris and encounters a sad-looking young woman who propositions him. He declines, but asks her where he can go to a nice bordello. Apparently unoffended, she walks him the 8 blocks to this unnamed brothel, and he gives her some money for the tip. Faced with every type of woman, big, small, every skin tone, he waffles, initially choosing a larger woman, and then settling on a small woman, and then proceeds to watch his activities in a wall mirror. Cool. He offers the madam $4 and is delighted that she laughs and only takes 3, leaving him $1. A perfect day. A few familiar places are also mentioned in this chapter, the first being the Café de la Paix, which appears in chapter 4 of this book, when he goes to the opera club. He mentions that the same people are there in 1949 as in 1935. It's clearly an important locale to him, and one that helped him feel like a real writer once he finally goes to Europe. San Francisco always had its art scene, but Paris was the mecca for American writers in the 20th century. He also stopped by the Hotel Scribe in 1935 and 1949, but the luster is lost for him in 1949. The Scribe became the headquarters for the Allied press during World War II, and before that was known to attract the bohemian types. It's rumored that Saroyan and Hemingway ran into each other at the Hotel Scribe in 1946, just after liberation. They exchanged sour words and reportedly got into a physical scuffle soon after at the Georges Cinq, though Saroyan denied the fracas. In 1935, he was only just beginning his feud with Hemingway, after Hemingway got testy with him and published some unfriendly words. And by 1935, Paris was already Hemingway's terrain, but that didn't stop William from embarking on his world tour, emboldened by his newfound success that nobody could reign on. As noted in the previous chapter's analysis, Saroyan celebrated women either for their roles as matriarchs or for their soft femininity. He did appreciate their power, one way or the other, although he rarely writes about them with full sympathy. The matriarchs are usually demanding and unforgiving, while the beautiful ones lack depth or loyalty, and are mostly described in physical terms. According to Lee Lawrence's biography, William was quoted as saying, "Women were meant to be beautiful." Why did he write this chapter? Like most of Saroyan's writing, it's not for us. It's for him. Or at least, it's a joke on us to see if we'll play along. He never really seemed to consider much what was marketable or appealing to his readers. He wrote to escape his life, to work out his demons, his madness, and because he had to, as he tells us in 1961. He also didn't edit much, creating output constantly. Some of that output was doubtless unappealing to the public, but that didn't bother him. Possibly this disinterest in his readers was the reason he could write so much, with abandon, because he was always writing as a form of self-expression, more than for commerce. People could take or leave him, in his mind. Of course, when they began to leave him, he did get grumpy, but he kept writing. He describes the Lost Bordello as about the size of a circus ring in which white horses trot around while men and women leap upon their backs and balance themselves gracefully. This also puts the daring young man on the flying trapeze in the minds of his loyal readers, perhaps subconsciously getting them in a good mood, even as he chooses a woman like a piece of meat. It puts his readers back in time again, to that freshness in 1935, when everything was new and connections were first being made, and maybe they too were experimenting. Chapters like this could be off-putting to some people, but he was clever with its presentation, and in broaching the uncouth subjects of life, this type of apparent authenticity appealed to many, especially the younger generation of writers in the mid-20th century. In Here Comes, There Goes You-Know-Who, he wrote, "I don't know how to write two ways, one for money and one for truth. I've got to believe I go for truth every time, even when I'm hired and writing for wages." Unbeknownst to many lovers of 20th century American literature, writers like Jack Kerouac, Joseph Heller, and Kurt Vonnegut all claim fandom for Saroyan. In each case, different aspects of Saroyan's style shine through, whether in his poetic rhythmic take on fiction or his insertion of autobiographical details. To these men and others, maybe a chapter like this celebrates and embodies male potency, a vibe full of urges, passions, delight, a driving motivation that led him not just to sex, but to literary creation. Although this is a chapter with moral ambiguity, there's a sense of innocence about it, a young man seizing life in every direction with joy and wonder. Again, we come to this term Saroyanesque, though admittedly this maybe wasn't what the general public had in mind when they heard the term in the 20th century. But Saroyan did turn a chapter about visiting a bordello into something full of wonder, and we are sympathetic towards him, rather than disgusted. There's really nothing too untoward about this description. It's downright celebratory, and one can't help but join in his enthusiasm, even as he treats women like flavors in an ice cream shop. This chapter may seem to be pushing the envelope, and it probably was to conservative audiences, but it wasn't that taboo in France. Since the Middle Ages, Paris mostly turned a blind eye to prostitution, and when it was addressed by law, it was usually in order to confine women infected with venereal diseases in the name of public health. After the French Revolution, prostitution was decriminalized, and about 40,000 women of the night plied their trade in Paris. In 1946, brothels were banned, though prostitution wasn't. In 1935, it probably wasn't shocking in Paris to be propositioned or to boldly ask around for a great brothel. Even in 1970s America, prostitution was becoming more normalized in pop culture, and even though New York law enforcement tried to crack down on it, It thrived in the 70s and 80s in the city. And perhaps Saroyan was aware of that. So again, this is something that was somewhat culturally accepted in 1935. And indeed, Saroyan tells us that the Lost Bordello was the best brothel he ever visited, because the women were the happiest. Let's not roll our eyes too hard at the idea of a happy hooker, but Saroyan was always about supporting one's choice to go your own way. Given the subject matter, he couldn't have started the book with this chapter, though. He had to build some goodwill first, telling us about his childhood experiences, his admittedly flawed adulthood. By now, we are emotionally invested in all parts of his life, so he's free to take some chances with content. Is this chapter still offensive to many? Surely. Who knows how deeply he thought about the placement of the stories in this book, or did his editor? But we will see that as the book progresses, he takes more chances with content and form, expecting that the reader will come along. The chapters are short enough, and it's not hard to move through the book quickly. And because he was a multidisciplinary artist at heart, this aligns with his beliefs about music, art, and writing. The purpose of art may be said to be to impel careful and creative looking at a given object, at anything, at everything. As the book progresses, it's not just questionable content that challenges the reader, but strange structure, form, and metaphorical approaches to storytelling that come at the end of the book, when inertia really drives us forward as readers. Taken as a whole, this book should be studied for its overall form and the way it plays on human instinct and emotions, his own and the reader's. There are untold reasons why he included this chapter, and it will of course resonate differently with each reader. For me, reading it as a woman in the 21st century, it tests my loyalty, maybe even challenges it. But he knew how to walk that line, and indeed I read on. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.